Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 141 Good taste. Turned out, Red Cliff wasn't really big enough to handle all the forces they were trying to cram into it, but Eamon wasn't the type to turn down a key role in saving the world, so he tried anyway. At least the Dalish, when they arrived a day behind the human forces, stayed in the surrounding countryside. Already, the inns and shops were packed, and the chantry was renting out floor space like a brothel. A chantry which, apparently, was already a little run down from an apparent undead invasion back near the beginning. All while Garrot had been playing the part of the rope in a political game of tug-of-war in Orzammar. He missed all the fun. Red Cliff Castle was full to bursting with visiting nobility and heroes from past wars. It seemed there was some hoity-toity feast or party every night, with Eamon playing the enthusiastic host. Garrot got it, he did. Fostering kinship and solidarity among the nobles that would be fighting beside you, and all that. He still couldn't stand it, though. And so, as the clinking of glasses and strains of highbrow music started up in the main hall, Garrot grabbed one of the better brandies off the table and slipped out into the night. He made his way down the path to the village, where strains of a livelier, more fun song rose from below. As he descended down into the village proper, he chuckled to find a different sort of celebration underway. Finian, it was going to be either him or Leliana, played a lively lute in the square, the elf reveling in having his fingers back to full functionality after the whole Fort Draken thing. Villagers and soldiers alike danced in circles around the square, accompanied by the sounds of laughter and heckling from those that sat around the edges, nursing tankards. There was a hefty man off to one side with a gigantic keg, doling out alcohol with a small legion of barmaids. Judging by the grin on his face, he was being compensated quite generously for his wares. Okaren could be spotted following one of the barmaids around, the dwarf bearing a tankard, a grin, and a fresh red handprint across one cheek. Garrot wandered along the edge of the festivities, looking for a semi-private place to lurk and enjoy his pilfered bottle. When he spotted a gaggle of familiar nobles enjoying a conversation off to one side of the chantry, Garrot beelined for it. Why? Well, mostly because the captain was smiling, and that was just too rare to pass up. There was a burst of laughter throughout the small circle as he approached, and Percival's head ducked in embarrassment, his hand reaching down to pat the Maberry at his feet. The trainer lets the puppy off the leash, Fergus continued through a laugh of his own, nursing a tankard. And it darts across the yard and barks right at him like a long-lost friend. Another burst of laughter. Father was trying so hard not to laugh that he had to drag Percy to Mother by his ear, just so he'd get a proper scolding. The circle roared with laughter, Percy joining in, much to Garrot's surprise. The group wasn't large, containing 5 of the friendly nobility from the land's meat, among them Ban Alfstana and Arl Wolf, all nursing drinks and chatting comfortably with the Kausland brothers. Behind them, working his way through a tray of cookies, was Sten, of all people. And yet the mutt chose you, boss, Garrot rumbled as he slipped up to the circle. I thought Maberry were supposed to be smart. Another round of laughter. Percival's smile was soft and self-depreciating, but comfortable, and Garrot honestly couldn't be happier for the guy. Managed to slip away from the castle, Garrot. Lot easier for me than you lot, probably. Except I got a souvenir. He held up his brandy victoriously, only for Alfstana to lean over and pluck it from his hands. Antivan brandy, the noblewoman said appreciatively. Say one thing about wardens, you all have excellent taste. Garrot snorted. All due respect, you ain't met many wardens. He could see why the captain was enjoying himself. The group was casual and friendly. Alfstana took a sip of the brandy and passed it around, and Garrot found he didn't mind. Speaking of my excellent taste, what's Sten doing here? Eating, the cunary supplied smoothly. A hint of mischief snuck into the captain's smile. I introduced him to the Red Cliff baker. Sten has an abominable sweet tooth. Pa, sweet tooth, Wolf rumbled. This fellow, strange though he is, has the most excellent taste in art. Not 2 hours ago, he identified a fraudulent painting Eamon has had over his mantle for years. The nobles chortled, and Sten licked his fingers casually. Garrot took a moment to stare at the cunary with a tilted head, a little baffled by that. Then Fergus pressed his now half-empty bottle back into his hands. "While we're sharing embarrassing stories about Percy," Fergus said, "have you got any good ones?" "Of the captain?" He smirked, and Percival groaned. "Well, yeah. But first, I got a question. How many of you know our boy here is a berserker?" That drew raised brows all around, except for Fergus, who chuckled, and Percival, who whispered, "Maker protect me." Settling down beside the fire with a bunch of human nobles, he was surprised to find that he was entirely comfortable, even among these pristine, goody two-shoes blue bloods. "Heh. We didn't either," he began. "As far as we knew, he just went a little crazy every time he fought. But then, see that guy over there? The dwarf copping a feel with the barmaid? Yeah, we had to hear it from him." Laughter flowed easily, and Garrot took a sip from his bottle, prepared to enjoy himself a little bit. They all owed it to themselves, right before the world ended. 142 classes in session. Knight Commander Grigoire was not entirely certain how much stock he put in these wardens. They were children, all of them. The morning after the mages arrived in Red Cliff, Grigoire stood post outside the chantry and watched the forces that would combat the evil unleashed by the Tevinter Magisters. The chantry was kind enough to lend out floor space for the handful of battle-ready mages they had been able to gather. In return, Grigoire offered his small contingent of Templars to aid in clearing out and rebuilding the Red Cliff chantry. He could only hope Cullen was doing well in watching the remaining mages, those too young or too old to fight back at Kinloch Hold. The Knight Commander worried about him. The boy had once had a good, calm head on his shoulders. Grigoire had once hoped to groom him for officership. However, since the takeover, he'd become unpredictable. Grigoire hoped his own absence from the tower would be a chance for the boy to prove himself, rather than a mistake. Grigoire stood at a post outside the chantry, listening to the once familiar sound of the chanter singing out into the busy square. It was a brisk, bright late morning, the soldiers occupying the town happy to consort with the civilian ladies. It had been some time since Grigoire had been at a post like this. At times, he missed it, watching the townsfolk go about their business beside the chanter's board. However, the work he did at the circle was far more important. "A beautiful day, isn't it, Grigoire?" The first enchanter's gravelly voice said behind him, and the mage came out of the chantry to stand beside him. The enchanter's craggy face split into a smile and he tilted his head back against the sun. Grigoire stifled a distant pang of guilt, that something so simple as sunshine meant so much to his old partner. "That it is, Irving," the Templar replied, keeping his stance and voice steady. "How are the mages faring this morning?" "Enjoying the change in scenery, I suspect," Irving replied. "As, I dare say, are you." Grigoire allowed a small smile. "It has been some time since I sat post at a chanter's board." He motioned across the square, where a young soldier snuck out the window of one of the houses. "What think you of this rabble we are to fight beside?" Irving hummed thoughtfully. "I think there is perhaps no better prospect than Magi, Templars, and common folk fighting alongside one another against a common threat. Wouldn't you agree?" An optimistic assessment, perhaps. Still, he had to hand it to his old colleague. "Certainly not one I would be against, at this point." Irving chuckled, and the two men stood out in the sunlight, enjoying the morning for what it was. After a time, Grigoire closed his eyes and simply absorbed the sounds and scents of a bustling lakeside town. Only when he heard a familiar voice on the breeze did he look up. Heading down the path from the castle were a pair of figures dressed in robes, with a third trailing a few steps behind. Grigoire recognized the two in front, even at distance. One was obviously Enchanter Wynne, with her white hair and careful grace in walking. Beside her, that darker coloring and brisk tread could only be Felicity Amel. Grigoire recalled easily the time she had come back to the tower during the incident with Uldred. He had been surprised then to have the scholar stand up to him the way she had, yet he could not say he would be surprised if the woman approaching now would do the same. Miss Amel's carriage was stronger and more confident than it had ever been in the tower, a different kind of wisdom guiding her steps. Felicity Amel the mage had been intelligent. Felicity Amel the Grey Warden was worldly. Only as they drew closer, and the conversation the two women were holding started drifting over to them, did Grigoire recognize the third figure. He had not seen Khazar Sirana since the boy's conscription, and he fought not to let his jaw drop in shock. It was not only the strange robes made of leathers and furs, nor the long, twisted branch staff. It was in the deliberately calm way the boy moved, in his sharp, but assessing gaze as he returned Grigor's stare. If Miss Amel's fire had been stoked up, then Khazar Sirana's had been tempered down. "Well, now," Irving said, noticing what Grigor did. "Would you look at that?" Irving stepped forward with a beaming smile and greeted them with, "It is so good to see all of you." "And you, Irving," Wynne said, ever the diplomatic one. Felicity, too, was beaming, holding a thick tome to her side. "We cannot thank you enough for agreeing to help. The mages could very well be the only possible way to ground the archdemon." She paused and nodded a brief greeting to Grigor. "That's why we're here. We must discuss strategy so that we may begin preparations as soon as possible." "Of course," Irving said. "Come inside. You will find everyone there." Felicity nodded and stepped in, leading the way into the chantry. Irving and Wynne followed easily, leaving Grigor to stare at the boy who'd once let a Maleficar escape. Khazar looked up at him, his, illegally, tattooed face a mask, and that was strange enough. Then, there was a short nod, no sarcasm or bitterness, just flat respect, and Grigor thought he must be in the Fade, for all the sense that made. It took him a moment to get over the shock, by which time Khazar had followed the other mages inside. Grigor shook his head in bafflement and entered the chantry building himself. Felicity was gathering the mages in the back of the building, where the Templars had managed to clear a prayer area. Felicity had a number of maps and diagrams, of dragons, from the look of it, that she pressed against the walls, and Khazar froze them in place with application of ice magic. That made Grigor raise his eyebrows. Mages were dissuaded from using their magic in such a frivolous manner, of course, but still, that was fairly clever and controlled, and that in reference to Khazar Sirana. "All right," Felicity said, clapping her hands and turning to the assembled mages. He could see the wheels in her head turning as she did a head count. Their small numbers did not seem to bother her overmuch, however, because she beamed and motioned for them all to sit in front of her. Not for the first time, Grigor mused that she would have been a good instructor of apprentices. "So, hello everyone. Nice to see you again. We've come by today to talk about how you will be needed to take down the archdemon. And you'll lead us?" Petra asked doubtfully. "The bookworm who can't even string a fireball together." "Petra," Wynne chided. "Have some respect. These two are Grey Wardens now." "It's all right, Wynne," Felicity said. Her face was flushed, but she plunged on. "Actually, no. I'll be needed with the other wardens, so I won't be leading you. Khazar will." That caused an uproar as several mages tried to talk at once. "Khazar? This little brat. He's a kid. He'll fireball us all for fun." Once, Grigor might have agreed with the protests, but watching him now, seeing how Khazar leaned back against the wall, watching the proceedings with more amusement than ire, made Grigor doubt that was the case any longer. As things got out of hand, Grigor raised his fingers to his lips and blew a sharp, loud whistle that had them all immediately silent. "Let the wardens speak," he barked in his best knight commander voice, and they settled down. "Thank you, Sir Grigor," Felicity said with some surprise. "Strategically speaking, we mages are the best chance of putting the archdemon on the ground. Without that, the forces outside will merely be throwing themselves upon the horde for nothing. So, we need strategy. Khazar, suggestions?" "Yeah," one of the mages scoffed, "like he knows anything." "And when did you fight the archdemon, Tatum?" Khazar asked. He pushed away from the wall with a smirk. "Anyone else here ever fight the archdemon? Hands up, now." "No, just me?" "Yeah, thought so." Khazar took a position beside Felicity, crossing his arms. "Look, this is easy. It's a dragon. That means it's a big lizard that flies. You take out the wings, and it's suddenly just an overgrown gecko with bad breath." Khazar was looking over them assessingly. "That means ice spells and thunder spells directed at the wings. Nothing big and fancy that wastes mana for a pretty boom, the army will need it down as fast as possible to mitigate the damage it does on flybys. So aim for the wings. Which reminds me, Felicity put in. The archdemon will have a breath attack. So we'll need to make as much warmth bomb. Spirit, Khazar interrupted. Spirit? You're sure? When it was blasting me in the face with it. Khazar returned, but there wasn't any actual ire in the statement, just more amusement. Yeah, pretty sure. Point taken. She smiled. We'll need to make as much spirit bomb as possible and distribute it amongst those most likely to be in close quarters with it. One of the mages raised her hand. Wouldn't blasting it get its attention? What happens when it comes after us? Khazar scoffed. Hello? We're mages? That's what spell shields are for. When have you ever used a spell shield? Felicity teased. That's what I have meat shields for. Also not the point. Well, I'll be, Irving whispered beside Grigor. Feeling a little sentimental, Grigor whispered back, are you, first enchanter? The enchanter's eyes twinkled. They do grow up so fast. Grigor bit back an amused smile and turned his attention back to the proceedings. Felicity was going over the dragon diagrams, pointing out weak parts of its anatomy. Then, to everyone's surprise, Khazar summoned a large ball of fire in the air before them and shaped into a three-dimensional model of a dragon. The way he animated it, making it swoop and flap its wings, Grigor could only assume they were telling the truth. Khazar truly had fought the archdemon before, or at least a dragon of some kind. As had Felicity, who stepped in and pointed out the weak spots on the fiery model. Once that was done, Felicity started listing off potions they'd need for the upcoming battle and the necessary ingredients, delegating mages, and sending each out with a shopping or foraging list. Once the last mage was off to try to find some mushrooms, Irving stepped forward. That was very well done, both of you. Felicity bowed her head. Thank you, first enchanter. Our best form of attack right now is preparation. We will verify its effectiveness once we encounter the horde on the battlefield. That is my concern, Grigor said, also stepping forward to engage the two wardens, and how strange to think of them as such, when he'd known them since they were children, particularly Khazar. You speak well of this hypothetical battle with the archdemon, but what of the rest of the horde? That will be in the hands of the king, Felicity said, suddenly turning stiff. What she means, Khazar cut in blithely, is that we've got several Arlings worth of armed fighters to cut down the horde. You Templars? You should concentrate just on cutting enough of a path to give your mages a clear shot. Khazar looked up at him with a raised brow. That's what Templars do, right? Guard mages. Why, yes, Grigor said with some surprise. Yes, it is. Good. Khazar started past, heading out of the chantry. We'll see how well you do it on the battlefield. Take care of yourself, Mr. Surana, Irving called to his retreating back. Always do, was the answer before the door shut behind the slender form. 143 Good news and bad news. As far as Finian could tell, Bodan was making a killing off the collective armies, yet the merchant couldn't spring for a single actual discount. Which did not work out well, when one was trying to get a new dagger ruined. Think about it, these are the daggers that could very well slay an archdemon and save Thetis. You should be paying me to enchant it. Enchantment. Sandal agreed from his seat by the cart, and Finn made a C motion. Bodan shook his head sadly. No can do, Warden. After Orzammer closed its doors for so long, the price of lyrium is just too high. We gave you a bag of lyrium. Last time you were at Red Cliff, remember? The dwarf smiled and shrugged, and Finian sighed. It seemed he'd finally met his match. This dwarf was a haggling mastermind. Fine, Finian threw down the requested gold, missing the days where he just stole everything he wanted. Being honest was hard. It wasn't like he could pickpocket a free enchantment anyway. Well, maybe he could bribe Sandal with a pasty or something when Bodan's back was turned. No. He was trying to be a good citizen. That meant no stealing. Well, okay, less stealing. He couldn't help but snag a coin out of an open purse every now and then, because, really, that was just asking to be pickpocketed. He was somewhat starting to think Alistair was right, and he had something of a problem. Delighted, Bodan took the elf's offhand dagger and triumphantly brought it to Sandal, who set about the precise, mystical work of inscribing a Silverite rune into it. The merchant's cart was settled just on the edge of town, where the army camps started on the road down to the town proper. Finian had once stood here while Khazar lit an entire path's worth of undead on fire. And so, today, Finian was the first one to see the movement over the next hill, a stream of thick, armored forms, punctuated by the occasional tall walking suit of armor. The dwarves were arriving. He whistled, impressed, as the army approached, because this was no token force, it was a tag's worth of capable warriors, many who no doubt had actual experience fighting Darkspawn. Their numbers appeared to be fewer than the human forces, but Finian would put a bet on them being far more deadly. Delighted, he hopped up onto Bodan's cart and waved. To his surprise, the marching force drew to a halt at the signal, and a pair of figures broke from the front and continued toward him alone. He instantly recognized one as Morrigan. There was no other silhouette in Thedas exactly like hers. The other was a dwarf, dark-haired, wearing fine armor, and with a relatively modest beard. As they neared, Finian could see by the pinching of Morrigan's mouth that something was wrong. He hopped off the cart and trotted up to meet her. "What's the matter?" "'Tis news out of the deep roads," she replied. "Come. We must speak with your Minders immediately." Finian nodded and turned to lead them back up toward the castle, where most of the wardens were gathered today. As he passed Bodan's cart, the merchant cried, "But your dagger, Messera." "You can drop it off at the castle when Sandal's done," Finn called back. "I'll even give you a tip if you do." Then they were out of earshot and heading up the winding cliffside road. As they passed under the portcullis, Finn flagged down the guards practicing in the yard. "Gather the wardens," he called. "Tell them to meet us in the Great Hall." The men scattered around the keep, hurrying to obey. "So what, exactly, is going on?" Finn asked Morrigan as they climbed the castle's front steps. "It's the Darkspawn," said the dwarf. His accent was closer to Marnin's than Garot's. "High caste, then. They're on the move." "Where?" Legion of the Dead spotted the archdemon leaving the deep roads. "Heading east." "East? That would put it moving towards." Finn suddenly felt weak, because they were south, and that suddenly seemed way too far in the wrong direction. He turned into Redcliffe's Great Hall, where the bloodstains of the battle with Connor would never really fade no matter how hard the servants scrubbed. Tegan and Leliana were already there, no doubt alerted to something by the shouts and motion throughout the castle. One by one, the others arrived, including Eamon, and Mila slinking in through the front door. Hugo bounded through the front entrance, alerting everyone to Percival's arrival, and Morrigan neatly sidestepped the dog's enthusiastic welcome. Upon seeing her face, Percy frowned. "Morrigan? Is something wrong?" "I'd say there is," Garrot chuckled as he slipped through the opposite door. "That idiot sent Gavorn as a diplomat." "Be mindful of how you speak of your king, Broska," the dwarf said. "Heh, king. Guy's practically my brother at this point." Gavorn huffed, and the last of their group, Win and Felicity, arrived. "So?" Eamon pressed. "What's so urgent as to call us all together like this?" Morrigan and Gavorn exchanged a look, then looked as one at Finn. "Oh boy. Well." Finian started. "There's good news and bad news." He offered them all what he hoped was an encouraging smile, only to be met with concern. "The good news is we no longer have to find a way to lure the archdemon out of the deep roads." They got the meaning, judging by the number of widened eyes and clenched fists. "Where," Percy asked, "exactly are we going to need to lure it from, then?" "That's the bad news." He cast a glance back at Morrigan, who nodded grimly. "From the sounds of it." "Denerim." A chorus of curses and hisses met the announcement. "Why would it be going there?" Leliana asked. "It has always avoided the big cities in the past. It's seeking to replenish its numbers," Felicity said in slow realization. "After what Khazar did to it in the Dead Trenches, it lost a good number of its horde, so it's heading for the largest population center nearby." "We have to head north, then," Khazar said. "Cut it off before it hits the Darkspawn buffet." "Wouldn't work," Percival said. He paced the room. We'd only fall behind it anyway. We need to head northeast to cut off its path. How fast was it going? Felicity asked, turning to Morgan and Gavorn. The dwarf shrugged. Search me. I only heard this from the Legion, they didn't give me much by way of details. Then we have to assume the worst, Alistair said. He took a breath and raised his voice, and Finian was once again proven that they'd done the right thing in making him king. We have to move out immediately. I want everyone suited up and ready to go within the hour. He motioned to the guards watching the door. Spread the word. 1 hour, and we march for Denerim. The Red Cliff soldiers nodded and took off running. So this is it, Percival whispered. Not quite, Felicity said. Before we go, there's something I think Riordan and I need to discuss with the wardens. Ah, come on, Okaren said, you can trust us. It is not about trust, I'm afraid, Riordan said. There are some secrets that only Grey Wardens can know. He sighed and nodded. Come, brothers and sisters. We will go discuss this someplace private. Riordan motioned them back through the doors. Finian knew a bit about reading people, so he couldn't help but detect all the secret looks exchanged between the two of them. He'd expected something like this for a while. Wordlessly, he threw a wink at Zevran, who perched in the corner, frowning, and followed the other wardens back through the winding halls to hear this mysterious secret. 144 The double-edged truth. His warden had not been able to look at him all day. Zevran did not claim to be a master at reading expressions. Not the way his Finian was, anyway. However, he was certainly savvy enough to know that whatever secret the Amel woman had told the wardens, it had upset them. The march out of Red Cliff had been quite morose because of it. Finian seemed to be more affected than most. He was twitchy and distracted, constantly fidgeting with his earring. At any other time, Zevran would have found the action endearing, but he couldn't shake the thought that the warden's distraction was in part due to himself, and so he worried. They called camp later that night than they usually did, and would no doubt get up earlier in the morning as well. Finian went off to talk in low voices to Riordan, and Zevran began setting up their tent in silence. He did so with perhaps a bit more murderous ire than was necessary, but the tent stakes were not about to complain. He did not enjoy being kept out of the loop. As he was kicking the last tent stake in with intent toward its eventual demise, Finian's hand abruptly closed around his wrist and yanked him into a stumbling walk. Zevran jumped and arrested a grab for his dagger, and would have chastised his warden on the foolishness of sneaking up on a professional assassin, but Finian was setting a truly brutal pace as he was pulled out over the rolling hills and down into a ravine that was hidden by trees. Finian was not a particularly strong man, nowhere near the likes of Percival or Alistair, or even Zevran himself, but his grip on Zevran's wrist was steel. Finian so rarely exercised his physical strength that Zevran could only wonder and worry as he was tugged down into the darkness of an overhang in the ravine. Even more so as he caught a flash of the dark expression on his lover's face. Finally, Finian released him, and Zevran caught his balance, stepping back to rub his wrist. He was not fond of being manhandled outside a bedroom setting, and Finian knew this. Something was very wrong. He stood and waited for his warden to say it. Except that Finian did not speak, and that was perhaps another tell. When Finian was upset, he bottled it up and hid it behind smiles and wit. It was a philosophy Zevran was not unfamiliar with himself. In these past weeks, Zevran had thought that he had broken past that. They both had. It had been a revelation on both sides. Could it be that his warden regretted? Was he about to take back everything? No, he was still wearing the earring. For some reason, that was very important to remember. Finally, Finian stilled, and turned to regard Zevran for a moment in silence. In the very dim light of the stars, Zevran could see wide, frightened eyes. Zev. He said at long last. You know I love you, right? Ah, and theirs was the final tell. They had a sort of unspoken understanding, that they would never speak that word aloud. Neither of them was comfortable with it. To speak it aloud was to admit that it may be their last chance to do so. That one of them was about to die. Amor, Zevran said shakily. You are frightening me. Finn turned and retreated back into the darkness, to resume pacing. Zevran could barely see his progress in the moonlight. There are some things I haven't told you, Zev. About being a Grey Warden. And there are some things I have not told you about being a crow. I do not want to tell them. It is all right. I understand. No. Finn's voice cracked. You don't. Zevran licked his lips, still worried and still uncertain as to the truth of this situation. Then help me to understand, Warden. It is obvious that something is bothering you. Tell it to me. We will share the burden, no. Finn shook his head in the starlight, but it wasn't a refusal. It's not your burden. But you have a right to know. Finian turned, and now, at least, resolution replaced the desperation in his eyes. What I'm about to tell you is a warden secret. You can't tell anyone, on pain of death for both of us. Again, I cannot help but appreciate the parallel between your wardens and my crows. A flash of a smile, but brief and sad. It was something, anyway. Do you know what makes Grey Wardens special? Why we're so important to fighting the Darkspawn? Zev shrugged. I had always assumed it was the fact that wardens are chosen from a pool of elite fighters, combined with excruciating training. Such is the case with most elite forces, certainly. It's more than that. He lowered his voice, despite the fact that distance and a wall of rock would have prevented anyone else from overhearing. Wardens are special because we've got taint in our blood. It helps us feel the Darkspawn. This was the big secret? It had to be more than that. Then I shall refrain in the future from drinking your blood, yes. Finian shook his head, not rising to the jest. There are two consequences of this. The first, all Grey Wardens are slowly dying of the Darkspawn taint. At that, something inside Zevran's chest twisted. He'd been involved in this blight long enough to see quite a few men succumb to the taint. It was not a peaceful death, and that by Crow standards. How slowly? Years. Decades, actually. It's fine for a while, until it comes on fast and hard near the end. They call it the calling, when a warden goes to the deep roads and takes down as many Darkspawn as he can before he succumbs. And it takes decades. The constriction around Zevran's heart eased a bit, and he allowed a short burst of laughter. Amor, do you have any idea the life expectancy of someone of my profession? Or yours, for that matter? If we managed to survive for decades, then I suspect we would not have lived well enough. That finally pulled a chuckle out of his lover, but it faded quickly. That's the second thing. About having the taint in my blood. Do not keep me in suspense, Warden. Again, Finian paced, and it was strange to see the other elf fighting to find the words. There's a reason wardens are necessary to slay the archdemon. Yes, the assassin replied with some annoyance. I do remember the healer hinting rather incessantly about something along those lines. She told us why, today. I didn't know. He spun toward him in earnest, panicking eyes flashed in the darkness. I swear, Zev, I didn't know. His warden was working himself up, so Zevran stepped forward and placed his hands on his lover's shoulders, steadying him. What did you not know? Please, I must know what has upset you so. Finian looked down and swallowed thickly. Felicity told us, that when an archdemon's body is slain, it doesn't die. We're talking about a tainted old god, so small surprise, right? So, instead of dying with the body, the spirit sort of, hops. Goes to the nearest Darkspawn and transforms it right back into what it was. Zevran froze, remembering how many Darkspawn he'd encountered. And like to be hundreds more, if the stories of this horde were to be believed. By that logic, the archdemon would be pretty much immortal. That's why the first blight lasted so long, Finian whispered. It just kept hopping, and no one could stop it. Not until the first wardens found a way. Zevran's grip on Finn's shoulders tightened. And this has something to do with the taint in your blood. Finn nodded. If, instead of a Darkspawn, a Grey Warden is nearest to the dying archdemon, its soul mistakes that warden for Darkspawn, it tries to enter a vessel that already has a soul, clashes, and is destroyed. Zevran couldn't breathe. Slowly, he said, and what happens to the Grey Warden's soul when it clashes? Finian looked down, and Zevran shook him, willing him to tell the truth. Amor, Tell me. What happens to the Grey Warden? His soul is destroyed with it. It was the softest whisper on the air, but it was utterly world-shaking. He dies. No. No, 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 no. You will not be this warden, Zevran growled. I will not let you be the one to do this. Well, I'm not going to try. Brown eyes flashed back up to his. Tradition dictates that the warden closest to his calling is the one to make the sacrifice. So, if all goes according to plan, it will be Riordan. Zevran could hear a but in Finian's voice. He did not want there to be a but. But. Fin continued, and Zevran flinched. If something happens, if there's an opportunity, or Riordan falls before we get to the Archdemon, we have to take any chance we can in stopping the Darkspawn. It's not a choice, Zev. Zevran let go. He suddenly could not touch Finian for one moment longer, and backed away swiftly as the other man reflexively reached out. He couldn't take this. This pain and loss, it was unacceptable. Why did you tell me this? He hissed. You had a right to know. Why? He waved a hand, finding that he was shaking. Why would you think it would be a good idea to tell me this? I know you, Warden. You will do this thing, like the danger-seeking martyr you are, and you now ask me to stay back and watch you do it, knowing what will happen? Why do you think this better than ignorance? I wanted to give you a chance. Fin said softly. To walk away before? That is no longer an option for me. Fin's eyes widened, and Zevran threw his hands in the air. As observant as his warden was, he was so very blind about some things. I was happy just being a runaway crow. I took my pleasures where I could get them, and if it was with an exciting, handsome warden, more the better. But no, you, with your smooth tongue, and your adventure-seeking, and your probing questions, and your fabricante condenato caring heart, you made me fall in love with you, and now I cannot walk away. He swooped in on his stunned warden, gripping him by the cuirass and shaking him. Do you understand? I cannot lose you. It was Rina all over again, except that this time it was so much worse, because this time there had been hope, and a future, and it was Finian himself who would take it all away, all because his damned bleeding heart would not let him do otherwise. Zevran slumped against his warden's chest as his strength fled under a tide of misery. I cannot lose you, he repeated softly against Fin's leather chest plate. Fin's arms wrapped around him, strong and gentle, and Zevran thought he really might cry. He knew how this would end. His warden would sacrifice himself if he felt it necessary, and Zevran would do nothing but watch. It would destroy him, but he could not stop his warden from doing anything that he felt needed to be done. Far better to follow him through the veil than walk away now. He would stand by his warden until the last, even though he knew doing so would destroy him. Fancy that. It seemed that he had come to Ferelden to die after all. 145 The Witch's Proposal. The sun had set, and the Kemps were collectively turning in to make an attempt at restless sleep. Tomorrow, they would reach Denerim. Percival paced around the command tent, where, an hour ago, the combined leaders of 4 armies and the wardens had stood around a map of Denerim and talked about how they would save the city, and Thedas with it. Percy had his doubts, as likely did most of the wardens. The non-wardens could not feel the darkspawn like they could. His blood curdled with it now, the song loud and alluring in his head, even while waking. He could feel them, a large force to the north of them. The horde would reach Denerim first, Percival was sure of that now. Their only hope was to catch up to the archdemon there and pray that there was still someone to save. The tent flaps rustled behind him, and Alistair stepped inside, eyeing the candles and maps grimly. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Percy shook his head, but finally allowed himself to rest against the table in the middle of the tent. The markers on the city map remained, denoting where each force would idealistically be stationed. All conjecture. Percival knew by now that strategy only truly lasted until the fighting began. For better or worse, Percival said, it ends tomorrow. For you maybe. Alistair made a face and pulled up to the other side of the table. I have to be king forever. Just think of all the cheese you'll have. I'm going to find a way to get you back for this. You're getting a hold or something. Maybe an Arling. Just you wait. That's almost enough to make me throw myself at the archdemon, Percival tried, but the jest fell flat. His sense of humor was terribly out of practice. Alistair slumped. I wish I could be there with you. But I get why I can't be. Percival nodded acknowledgement, and the two stared at the map for a while, pondering past battles gone awry. Promise me one thing, Percy. Name it. Promise me that, whatever happens, you won't let it be her. Percival glanced up, but Alistair's eyes were distant. We don't know what will happen, he began. I don't care. Alistair took a shaky breath. Look, I know I don't have any claim on her or anything. She can't even look at me anymore. But I just couldn't stand it if, just please. Promise me. Percy only had to consider it a moment. I promise. Vow it, Alistair said, meeting his eyes fervently. As a cow's land to his king, vow to me that you will not let it be her. I vow it, Percival said softly. Felicity will not make the sacrifice. I vow it, Alistair. Alistair held his gaze for another moment, then a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. Well, good. That's good. He nodded to himself. You really should get some sleep, Percy. I suspect tomorrow's going to be a long day. Percy nodded, taking it as an order from his king, and nodded a good night. He left the command tent, quashing the voice in the back of his mind that said he really could not guarantee that Felicity would remain away from the archdemon. No, it was done. He'd promised, and Acaus Land stood by his word. That was all there was to it. He was deep in thought as he ducked into his own private tent, so he did not notice the candle lit within until he was inside. Once in, he stopped dead, because Morrigan was waiting for him. Two things were wrong with this. First, Morrigan had not sought him out since her return. He'd not shared a bed with her since she'd been sent out to tell the dwarves to march. He might have considered the possibility that her current presence was her fatalistic side making her want one more night before the big battle tomorrow, but for the second thing. She had lit a candle. He stood in the doorway, studying her. She sat in his camp chair, her back straight upright with her hands on her knees in a stiff, formal posture. No lazy sprawling or easy grace. She had her clothes on, which was perhaps for the better if she'd put a light on. And her facial expression, she waited with a touch of anxiety, all beguiling eyes and mysterious smiles washed away by something else. He was almost afraid to move, lest he scare off this strange, wary creature. Well, she said, an echo of her characteristic bite in her voice, will you loom all night, or will you sit? Percival complied, moving carefully into the tent to sit down on his camp cot. This is an unexpected visit. Did you wish to speak with me? If it were possible, she stiffened even further. As a matter of fact, I did. I have a plan. A way out. A pause. A loop in your hole. Percy rubbed his eyes, he really did not have the energy for this. Morrigan, what are you talking about? I know what happens when the archdemon dies. Percival's head shot up. She met his gaze evenly. I know a Grey Warden must be sacrificed, and I know that sacrifice could be you. There was a flash of uncertainty in her eyes, quickly hidden. I know a way that this may not be so. Percy was still reeling with the knowledge that Morrigan knew. How long? Or simply how? This is Grey Warden knowledge. How did you come upon this? What does it matter how I know? She said. What matters is that I know it, and I know a way to stop it. You are being deliberately vague, and you know it. A twist of a smile flashed across her features. Maybe so. I know of no other way to be. That was a correct statement, if ever there was one. Percy found himself smiling fondly. I suppose I always did enjoy a challenge. She tilted her head. I think I shall take that as a compliment. It relaxed her posture at least, so Percy found his own matching. He leaned back on the cot. Very well, Morrigan. I make no promises, but I will hear you out. What is this miraculous solution? Miraculous may not be the correct word, she said thoughtfully. That made him stiffen again. He sat up, and she met his gaze evenly. Openly, now, there was a silent pleading in her eyes, asking just that he hear what she had to say. You are still being vague. Tell me what it is. She seemed to chew on the word for a moment, holding it back in hopes that it might become more savory. A ritual, she finally said. Performed on the eve of battle, in the dark of night. Tonight. And so here I am. Percival knew there was more to this ritual. He could read her now, she was holding back. It's blood magic, isn't it? 'Tis old magic, she said. I doubt the current circle of magi would have any equivalent. Some might call it blood magic, but that is merely a name. There is far more to fear in this world than names. Percival felt short of breath. Did this mean that Morrigan was a blood mage? No, that was perhaps unfair. Morrigan defied such labels, she transcended them. Percy stood abruptly, needing to pace, only to find Morrigan moving to step into his path. Do not dismiss this because of societal preconceptions. I only mean to help. What does it do? Percy said, feeling his anger stirring. You have not yet answered that. She fidgeted with her hands for a moment before finally offering a crooked nod. That is fair. Very well. She took a step away, pacing the small tent herself. What I propose is this: you lay with me. Here, tonight, on the eve of battle. From our joining, a child will be conceived. A wave of vertigo had him sitting back on the cot, hard. A child? The child will bear the taint, she continued, as if that wasn't world-rocking enough. And so, when the archdemon is slain, its essence will seek the child like a beacon. Another shock rocked him. You would kill an innocent child? Our child. It will not perish, she said calmly. She moved to stand over Percival, then knelt down before him, running a soothing hand down his arm. At this early stage, it will absorb the archdemon's essence, destroying the taint while the child lives on. A child? Maker. Morrigan's golden eyes were steady on his, her touch gentle and soothing on his arm. He swallowed. And what would absorbing the soul of an archdemon do to our child? 'Twould be just that. A child with the soul of an old god. She paused and looked away. After this is done, you must allow me to walk away. Do not follow me. Ever. The child will be mine to raise as I wish. It was too convenient. His head drooped, because he realized where she had gotten her information. This was Flemeth's plan all along, wasn't it? This is her endgame, and why she sent you with us. Morrigan pulled away and stood. 'Tis true that Flemeth was the one who provided me with this ritual, but I assure you that now I do not offer this for her sake. Then whose? Yours. He couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. What could you possibly want with this child? I do not do it for my sake, but for yours. Now, finally, her voice rose from its silky purr. If we do this, you will be able to go into battle tomorrow without worry of being forced to make the sacrifice. If you do not wish it for yourself, then consider that it might save one of your fellows, should the burden fall on them. 'Tis truly that simple. It's not simple, Morrigan. It's blood magic. A child. His voice cracked on the word. How could you expect me to have a child with you and then simply walk away? You cannot ask me not to follow you. She hesitated, looking taken off guard. There has never been any question in my mind that you would want to, she said. Why? Do you? A challenge. He bit back his automatic response. Maker. I told you not to become attached, Warden. She sounded sad. He stared up at her stiff form. You're a damned hypocrite, you know that. This will work, I promise you. It will work, and it will save your life. That is all you need know. He stood and paced a step toward the door, ready to walk out it. He needed to rip something apart. A blood magic ritual, he muttered. You come to me in the dead of night, and ask me to partake in a blood magic ritual, set by the mother you despise. You ask to carry my child. Again, that hitch. And then deny me the opportunity to ever know it, to watch it grow. You deny me the chance to ever watch you. Maker, Morrigan, Do you even understand what you're asking of me? He stopped and spun on her. She met his gaze with that stubborn tilt of her chin, but her eyes, they were soulful and deep. Yes, yes, she did understand, yet she asked it anyway. He could not hope to puzzle out the complex layering of emotions in those golden eyes, and he was swiftly realizing that he would never get the chance to. No matter what he decided, he was losing Morgan. Tonight. No matter what. He turned from her, facing the exit of the tent, and closed his eyes. He should leave, say farewell to this blood ritual, and Flemeth's plans, and heartbreak, and leave. He had seen enough of Flemeth to guess that this was not over as far as the witch was concerned. If he did this thing, he and Morgan would be playing right into the witch's hands, and no amount of stubborn survivalism on Morgan's part would stop her. But perhaps Morgan had a point. It would save a life. Perhaps Reardon's, perhaps his own. Perhaps any of the wardens. Had he not just vowed to Alistair to do anything to stop Felicity's demise? What if this could save Felicity? Only for the archdemon's soul to travel into a helpless child. Their child. He'd have a little boy or girl, and something in his chest swelled at the thought. He wanted a child, suddenly so keenly that it filled the void in him that his parents' deaths had left. A family of his own. Him, and Morgan, and their child. Except that Morgan would not allow him to have that. She was fiercely independent, that he knew well. She was denying his involvement, and she was stubborn enough to stand by that until the day of his calling. The child, O Maker, what would Flemeth do with the child, if she caught it? No, he could not subject a defenseless child to that. Best that it never exist than be used for Flemeth's ends. Except something in him yearned for one last night with Morgan. Just one. Except that night would be a blood magic ritual. He'd had his off days, but he was still a follower of the Maker at his core. He couldn't partake in blood magic. Did he not owe it to his wardens to give them the chance to live? Did he not owe it to himself to keep his moral integrity? Did he allow a warden be taken from the world who might one day save it, or bring a child into the world who might one day doom it? Did he, or didn't he? Yes, or no? He opened his eyes, and made his decision. 146 Denerim, the city gates. And now he was supposed to make a speech. There was a city crawling with darkspawn behind him, and Finn was giving him an encouraging smile, and for some reason he was standing in front of hundreds of men and dwarves and elves and being expected to make a speech. How did you make this better than it was? You didn't. Alistair remembered rallying speeches by Kaelin and Duncan, and a few by his warden companions besides. The words didn't need to be pretty, but they needed to be right. These were darkspawn. He was a grey warden. That, he could handle. Before us stands the darkspawn horde, he said, looking out over the assembled forces. Gaze upon them, but fear them not. Was that awkward? That sounded a little awkward, but it seemed like the sort of thing a king would say. He had to keep going, because all these people were about to lay their lives on the line for him. Beside me today stand my warden brothers and sisters. They come from diverse backgrounds, from the forests to the south, to Highever in the north, under the mountains in the west, and from here, Denerim itself. All different, but they have one thing in common, they all love Ferelden, and will fight to see her free of this darkspawn menace. They are proof that glory is within reach of us all. He worked his way off the dais, moving to stand before the armies on their level, ready to lead them. Today, we save Denerim. Today, we avenge the death of my brother, King Kaelin. But most of all, today we show the Grey Wardens that we remember and honor their sacrifice. For Ferelden. He raised his hands, and the lines prepared to charge the city. For the Grey Wardens. And so they charged. Alistair was not about to hold back among the safety of second rank, not in this. No, he led the charge, hitting the darkspawn crawling around the front gates head-on, bashing one Hurlock with his shield and immediately bouncing off to slice his sword into another. He could feel the thrumming of the horde all around them, but he concentrated on cutting open darkspawn after darkspawn as the front line pushed its way through the city gates. And then, suddenly, they were spilling through. Alistair felt a push behind him, and he and the men near him burst through the front gates and into the city proper. The place was a battlefield all right. The gatehouses and buildings in the entrance square were burning, nearly down to the last one. Darkspawn were everywhere, lunging off rooftops and out of alleys to meet the invaders. Alistair raised his hand and shouted something vaguely inspirational, and the human soldiers he'd come in with cheered and leapt to attack. It did not take long for the assembled forces to clean up the front square, so that all they needed to worry about were the occasional genlocks creeping along the edges. Most of the stronger Darkspawn forces had no doubt already penetrated deeper in. Alistair took a moment to catch his breath, looking around at dwarves and elves and humans, and he was suddenly very proud to be here, part of this. There was a roar from above them, and an angry, taunting cry went up in response from the assembled armies as the archdemon swooped overhead, low enough to let them know it was aware of them, but not enough to get within range of arrows. Not that several of the Dalish archers did not loose a volley anyway. The great dragon wheeled and flew away toward the back of the city, cutting through columns of smoke as it swooped toward the distant spire of Fort Dricken. "Wardens!" Alistair shouted. "To me!" The wardens converged in the center of the square, and Eamon appeared at Alistair's shoulder. "All right," Alistair said, looking around at his friends and companions. Already, Percival and Okaren were coated in Darkspawn blood, and Wynne moved among them, offering a final patch job on any injuries they'd taken during that first scuffle. "All right, this is it. We're here. The archdemon is here. We're going to take it out. We await your command," Percival said softly. "Right." Alistair cast a glance back up, where the dragon could be seen perched atop Fort Dricken. "The Red Cliff soldiers will stay here and guard this square, to make a safe place for survivors to go and to make sure no more Darkspawn get into the city. Eamon, do you think you can handle that?" "I would rather be fighting beside you," the Jarl said. "Too bad. You're guarding the square. You're the one I trust most to do it." Eamon sighed and reluctantly nodded. "Good. In the meantime, I'll take the human forces and sweep the city, clearing out the body of the horde and looking for survivors." He glanced up at Sten, because someone had been holding out military training on them. "There's a lot of them, going a lot of places, so Sten, you'll help me direct the forces." The Cunary nodded. "As it should be. I will take the Dalish to the rooftops," Mila said. "We will be able to gain entry to areas the ground forces cannot." "Excellent idea." Alistair grinned at her, and she offered a muted smile back. "In the meantime, Garrot, you take the dwarves and cut a path straight back to the palace district. Khazar, follow them and find a clear shot when you can. Cut that dragon's wings. Once that's done, concentrate on clearing the horde." The elf mage nodded gravely. "We will also be following the dwarves, then," Riordan said. "If you manage to get the archdemon down, we will need to be ready to leap upon the opportunity. And if you do not manage to get it down," Zevran said with a sharp grin, "we may simply need to be ready to leap upon the archdemon." Alistair nodded. "That may come up, yes." He cast one more glance around the wardens, and his chest tightened to think that at least one of them would not be coming back out of this battle alive. "Be safe, everyone. What we do today will save Ferelden and beat back the Blight." "In war," Finian said, putting his hand out between all of them, "victory." Percy laid his hand on Finn's. "In peace, vigilance." One by one, they all put their hands in. Garrot, Mila, Khazar, Felicity, Riordan, and himself, all grasping hands in brotherhood. As one, they all murmured, "In death, sacrifice." "For the Grey Wardens," Alistair repeated, and they all broke away, heading off in different directions to go save the world. 147 Denerim, Market District. "Gotta hand it to Branka," Okaren said, sweeping his axe under a charging hurlock, sending it sprawling. She may be met as a lyrium minor, but she knew what she was doing with the golems. Garrot snorted agreement, even as he stepped in and put his dagger through the downed hurlock's eye. "Handy buggers, aren't they?" He dodged aside as an ogre charged past them. As if to prove their point, a golem lumbered up and met the ogre head-on. The two locked arms and began grappling, giving Okaren time to walk up behind the ogre and plant his axe in its back. Garrot turned to find the avenue they were pushing through relatively clear, and he nodded to Vartag Gavorn. Belen's right-hand man returned the nod and gave a broad hand motion, and a nearby trumpet blared what Garrot could only assume was an order to advance. He ran with the dwarves, a little voice in his head cackling at the fact that he was in a sodding line of warriors, and he, the duster who had defiled the proving, was not only accepted but respected. Except Belen hadn't just sent warriors for this, funnily enough. It seemed the king had already begun his forceful restructuring of Orzammar society. Garrot spotted not a few merchant haircuts among the forces, and those dwarves holding the golem control rods were definitely smiths. And, wouldn't you know it, he even noticed a smattering of casteless brands, at the part of the line where the fighting was dirtiest. The sodding bastard had done it. He'd gone and let dusters into the army, and probably fought the assembly tooth and nail for it too. Sure, it may have just been a bid to scrounge up more darkspawn fodder, but Garrot would count that as a step in the right direction anyway. They smashed through into the next square. Though they still had a ways before they hit the palace district, this was definitely a fancier neighborhood, to the point where the houses in this area actually looked worth looting, if they hadn't been on a bit of a time crunch. That was progress. A pair of emissaries waited for them in the middle of the square, and one immediately loosed a surge of chain lightning into the dwarven line. A few of the men laughed, including Garrot, and the dwarves collectively shrugged the magic off and charged. Garrot gave the emissary a good hamstring before continuing and leaving it to his bigger, stronger brethren. He hopped over a fountain in the middle of the square, dipped into his pocket, and released a handful of explosive caltrops, just as a trio of genlocks were charging past. They stumbled and grunted against the popping things, and Garrot swung his hand axe into the back of one's neck. The other two recovered more quickly than he'd predicted, and he found himself stumbling back as one turned and lunged at him. A moment later, both genlocks were blasted aside by a friendly burst of fire. Garrot's bracer caught fire from the blast, and he patted it out. Little close, don't ya think, elf? Khazar emerged from the press with a smirk. He idly sent a puff of nature magic at a shriek across the square, and a tangle of vines sprang from the ground to bind it. The nearby dwarves leapt upon it like a pack of deep stalkers upon carrion. It's what I like about fighting alongside dwarves, Khazar said, moving to stand next to Garrot. I don't have to be as careful with my aim. Khazar, really? Wynn's voice could be heard scolding from nearby, but Garrot was hard-pressed to say where. An ogre rumbled past, slamming into a line of dwarves and roaring. A volley of spells, slung from a small group of mages near an alley, turned its attention from the dwarves. It roared and started toward them, but a pair of Templars moved in to block its progress. Garrot sighed. We better get on that. Yeah, Khazar groaned reluctantly. Then, he waved both arms and burst of lightning shot out of him, making the ogre seize up. Garrot and two other dwarves were on top of the ogre before it had even stopped sparking. Garrot got the credit for the kill though. He did as he'd once seen a certain crazy elf do. He got up on its back with his hand axe acting as climbing pick, and nested on the back of its neck behind its horns. It tossed its head uselessly back and forth, and Garrot just laughed and brought his dagger down in its eye. It fell, throwing him about 8 feet away to land in a rolling heap, and Khazar started laughing. The horn signaled to advance again, and the dwarves and mages continued on. 148 Denerim, the alienage. Below them, the streets were overrun with swarms. In one area, it was a swarm of humans, in another, a swarm of dwarves. In most others, the darkspawn seethed like a nest of disturbed ants. The Dalish sprang from rooftop to rooftop, above it all but deadly against these swarms all the same. Mila did not need to direct them, she would not presume to. She merely told the other warriors their task, and they all climbed up and moved to do it. More than once, Mila found Leliana and herself participating in a kill pocket, where the Dalish surrounded an alley or corner from all sides and fired death from above, massacring any darkspawn unlucky enough to congregate there. Once that was done, the Dalish continued on, spreading out in search of areas cut off by tumbled walls and barred gates. Leliana did a commendable job keeping up with the elves, despite how they swiftly moved across steeply sloped shingles and uneven, broken walls. Her inherent humanity made her just that little bit less graceful, but she never complained, simply moved steadily onward alongside the elves. Suddenly, the human paused and looked around. Is everything all right, Mavihanen? This area. I remember it. The bard took off over the rooftops in an easterly direction, and Mila followed. A handful of Zithrian's clan shadowed them along the rooftops on either side. It took her a moment to realize where they were headed. Once she did, she understood the bard's concern. The district in question only had 2 major exits, after all. Sure enough, Leliana hopped from a roof to a bit of broken wall and worked her way into the alienage. Again, Mila followed. The 2 archers stopped on the rooftop of a tall wooden structure just inside. From here, they could see most of the district, at least enough to see the blackened taint working its way into the bark of the Vihendhul. Mila could sense the other Dalish spreading across the nearby rooftops, and she could sense her fellow elves' wariness as they realized where they were. A glance at the exits confirmed that the city elves were at risk. The bridge that led into one part of the city had tumbled, leaving only one exit. Through that exit streamed a seething mass of dark spawn. They roared and shoved up against a flimsy wood and stone barricade the Flat Ears had erected across the only remaining path. Even against the pressure and buckling defenses, the elves fought back with what little they could scrounge up, sticks and gardening tools and whatever was available. They are strong, no. Leliana said softly with a smile at Mila. Everywhere else, the citizens hide in their homes, but here, they fight. Mila nodded agreement. The Elvaean fight to protect our home, even if it is little but a squalid cage. Leliana reached over and briefly clasped Mila's hand. Let us help them save it. Mila smiled, because there had never been any other option, and the pair hopped down to the next rooftop, working closer to the barricade. Once they had a clear shot, they knocked their bows and let loose as one. A volley of arrows soared from other rooftops as Dalish made themselves known all around the alienage, and the darkspawn pressing against the barricade collapsed. Stunned, the city elves below pulled back from the barricade. Mila and Leliana brought their bows up again, joining in a second volley from above. The alienage elves were staring up at the rooftops with wide eyes, and Mila smiled, even as she released another arrow. Finally, after 6 volleys, the darkspawn that had been invading the alienage were dead. Below, the alienage elves let out a cheer. Mila. Someone called below, and she looked down to see Finian's red-haired cousin, grinning up at them and waving. Leliana. Hi. Mila slid her way carefully off the roof, dropping 2 stories to land near the grinning elf. All around her, other Dalish were following her example, much to the awe and gratitude of the resident Flat Ears. Are you all right, Shiani? Leliana asked, landing next to Mila. How is everyone doing here? Well, we were fine, until the creepers showed up. Shiani wrinkled her nose. Are those darkspawn? I have to say, I don't envy Finn. She paused, looking around. Where is he, by the way? Is he all right? He is well, Mila assured her. He is needed elsewhere at the moment. Typical. We could use a little help here, and he's skiving off again. She sighed in mock exasperation, and Leliana giggled. We are here, Lethalin, Mila said. Shiani tilted her head to one side. I don't know what that means, but I like the sound of it. Come on. The elf grinned. There was a fair bit of Finian in that grin and headed back toward the barricade. A few darkspawn were creeping through the doorway into the alienage. Dutifully, the Dalish warriors created a line across the barricade, ready to drive the creatures back. I think, Leliana said cheerfully, taking a place in the line, this calls for a Dalish war anthem, no? Mila smiled. I do believe it does. Even the members of Zithrian's clan cracked a few smiles as Leliana launched into a song of elven heroes past, and so it was they fired the first volley in defense of their city-born kin. 149 Denerim, Palace District. Fort Draken loomed overhead, and the palace square had been cleared by a relentless line of walking suits of lyrium-coated armor. They were as close to the archdemon as they were likely to get. Everyone present and accounted for. Knight Commander Grigoyer's voice called out, and the Templars sounded off all around them. Literally around them. When Khazar had stopped the mages and gathered them here, on the balcony in front of the royal palace, the Templars had formed a protective perimeter of steel. Not that Khazar was complaining at this point. It would be really stupid if, while trying to kill the archdemon, they all ended up spit by a stray genlock. "So, my boy," Irving's voice said. "What's the plan?" Khazar didn't take his eyes off the silhouette of the dragon circling above them. It was staying high. Occasionally, it swooped out over the city, letting loose a roar or a blast of spirit fire, but it then returned to hugging the tower. Probably had a good view of its horde from up there. "Easy," Khazar said, watching it take another loop. "We shoot it." "Our spells can't possibly reach that high," one of the mages complained. "Pagel. You ever tried?" Khazar watched the dragon perch to land on the tower, and turned to look at the other mages. All older than him. All of them way more scared. "It's not possible," Pagel insisted stiffly. "It's too far." "Don't tell me what's impossible," Khazar snapped. "We are all open conduits to the fate. We bend forces of nature to our will. Possibility ceases to have any relevance when it comes to mages." He glanced back up. Yep, it was still on the tower, a looming silhouette. "We can't all be primal prodigies," Petra said doubtfully. "Fine. Then I'll bring it down closer." Irked, Khazar did what he could to gather his magical power. Words aside, he was aware that this dragon was a great deal farther than most spells could reasonably travel. He closed his eyes and summoned a burst of power from the depths of the earth itself. Rock and stone came alive around him, crawling with the dark spontaneity, and he felt the earth shaking slightly under his feet. Then, he opened his eyes and sent the burst of magic, still coiled and unreleased, rocketing up the side of Fort Draken, straight up the tower and to the top. It slipped out of his control about halfway up, too far for him to grip properly, but the magic was set in motion. It burst as it ran out of stone at the top of the tower, and the portion of the tower the archdemon was perched on exploded in a hail of dust and stone. It slipped off with a shriek. "Now!" Khazar snapped, watching the archdemon spin and tumble down toward them. It unfurled its wings and managed to stop its descent about halfway down, and then a volley of thunder and ice spells ricocheted off its scaled hide. The archdemon roared and wheeled around in midair, then dove into a low swoop over the mages' positions. Wynne and Irving erected a shield around the mages and Templars, just as the dragon blasted them with a spirit burst. Even shielded, it knocked most of them off their feet. Khazar was among those who had to pick himself up. "Well, we angered it," someone said. "Now what?" "What do you mean, now what?" Khazar snapped. "Hit it again." As if on cue, the archdemon's roar rocked the square, and it swooped in for another pass. This time, Khazar was ready with a blast of lightning, catching its wing but barely making it twitch. The archdemon passed over them and flew away, with little but a few patches of ice on its scales to speak of their efforts. "It's not doing anything," Pagel called. "We must be persistent," Wynne said. The archdemon came by for another pass, and as it opened its mouth to release its breath weapon, Khazar burst a fireball in its face. It shrieked angrily, but arrested its swoop and started climbing. "Great, now you made it go up again," Pagel groaned. Sure enough, the archdemon was back to circle high, near the top of the tower. Khazar clenched his fists, because this wasn't working. At this rate, the dragon would flatten all of them before it took any significant amount of damage. The little attacks aren't working. We need something bigger. Bigger how? Something strong. Inescapable. He recalled the fight with Flemeth. What had it taken to take her down and keep her there? Storm of the century. There were some gasps and murmurs to that. It was a technique not often used, because spell combinations like that had a way of getting out of control. "Even if we could conjure a storm like that," Pagel said, "there is no way to do it from this far away. Not even you could do a spell that's strong from this distance." Khazar watched the dragon resume its lazy circling. "We have to try. We're going to fail. We don't have a choice." Khazar spun on the mages, just daring them to contradict him. "Look, you guys want to be hated and feared forever? This is our chance to prove that mages can be an asset. And more importantly, we can't afford not to succeed. We have to bring that dragon down, no matter the cost. Failure is not an option." The mages around him exchanged uncertain looks, except Wynne, who smiled encouragement, and Irving, who calmly asked, "What, then, is your proposed course of action?" Khazar took a breath. They could do this. He could do this. He had to. We conjure the storm, but not up there. Down here. He paused, eyeing Grigor. You Templars may want to give us a little more space. The Knight Commander raised a brow, but nonetheless expanded the perimeter to about twice the size it had been. Are you trying to get us all killed? Petra asked in shock. We can't withstand a storm like that. There's no way to control it. Yes, there is. You just need enough power. Khazar glanced up one last time, then around. Center it on me. Start conjuring, and then get out of the way. Win. I think an elemental bomb or two may be in order. He turned to find that she was already digging through her bag. Look, one of the mages, Ioria, said, I want to blast you in the face as much as the next mage, Khazar, but if you lose control, this will kill you. Then I won't lose control. He took the bombs Wynne offered him and hurried to apply them. Above them, the archdemon roared, swooping down to snap at something near the harbor. Hurry up, get in position. Khazar found himself standing alone in the center of the square, with mages and Templars alike forming a wide-eyed circle around him. He understood their concern. What he was trying was dangerous and stupid on at least 4 levels. But it was a risk he was willing to take. No, it was a risk he had to take. Otherwise it was all for nothing. Otherwise, Jowan had died for nothing. They gave him a moment to steady himself. He summoned his magic, letting it crackle over him and extend around him, tendrils of power and magic infusing the air. Irving cast first, and the air around Khazar heated up into fire swirled into existence around him. He reached out and gripped the forming vortex, taking control of it before it turned him into a charred husk. He spun it around himself, feeding it with his own magic until it followed his bounds instead of Irving's. Then, the air in the vortex crackled with ozone, and lightning cracked through it. Khazar hissed as a bolt caught his staff and zapped through him, but he did not release his control of the fiery vortex. The thunderstorm, too, he reached out and grabbed, threading it around the fire magic until the ground itself around him was scorched with the destructive power. Finally, the third component, from multiple sources by the feel of it. Shards of ice blasted around and through the storm, defying the heat and making the stone under his feet bitterly cold. This, too, Khazar grasped and fed and wove into the storm, creating layers of magic upon magic that fed one another with sheer destructive power. This would do it. This would make the difference, if he could only get it up there. And so, Khazar fed even more of himself into the storm, and taking control of the whole thing was like wrestling a bear. He felt when he hit the limits of his strength, and it wasn't enough. He could not fail. He would not fail. This was what he was here for. For this, he'd sold his soul. He would not fail. He shoved past a mental dam and a surge of demonic magic burst into him from the Fade. Suddenly empowered, he knew that he could do this. He would bring the archdemon to the ground, because he was the most talented mage of his generation, and that was that. With everything he had, he surged the storm upward, and it went in screaming, frothing fury. Somewhere nearby, he heard gasps, but could not afford to pay any more attention to the mortals on the ground. The archdemon wheeled overhead, and he slammed the storm into it. A roar echoed over the city as he trapped the dragon within it, compressing it into a cage around the great beast. Even from here, Khazar could feel the storm tearing holes in its wings, and he smiled. The storm burned out quickly once it was away from Khazar, but it had done its job. As the gigantic ball of magic dissipated, the archdemon could be seen careening through the air, flapping in a desperate attempt to keep its elevation. It slammed into the side of the tower near the top, and scrabbled to get a foothold on the roof. Khazar smiled as a wash of pride went through him at the sight. Sure, it was still far away, up on the top of Fort Draken, but it was safe to say it wouldn't be taking to the air again. Khazar sighed and finally let go of his magic. He looked down, just in time to catch the cracks of red light fading from his own skin. He felt the rock of a holy smite slamming into him. A moment later, a steel blade pressed up against the back of his neck, and Knight Commander Grigor's voice growled, "Abomination. 150 End of the road." It certainly was thoughtful of him, no. Zevran's voice said lightly as they climbed their way up the circling flight of stairs. To delve into a darkspawn-infested tower, just to deliver a dagger he was putting a rune on. What I can't figure out, Finn replied, staring at said dagger, is what he put on it. This is not the Silverite rune I ordered. If it is half as effective as whatever he used to kill that veritable bloodbath around him, I would call it an improvement. Felicity, staying at the back of the group, bit her lip and climbed in silence. For once, she had nothing to add. The sight of Sandal, alone and surrounded by a circle of dead darkspawn, defied explanation. Both of you, be quiet, Percy said tightly. We're nearing the top. Good, Finn said. My legs are killing me. Did they really need to build a prison tower this tall? I am glad I am not the only one feeling this climb, Riordan mumbled with a small smile. It makes me feel a bit less old. Percival cast a glance back at them, and all three rogues fell quiet. Felicity ached for him, enough to understand why his temper was short today. After all, Felicity hadn't been the only one to wake up that morning and wonder where Morrigan's tent was. Felicity did not perhaps know the extent of Percival's relationship with Morrigan, but she knew something had been there. To have her abandon them the day of their big battle, it was no surprise he was so dour. Such thoughts only led her to her own love life, however, so she steered clear of that and focused on business. They had been watching from amongst the dwarves as the mages took the archdemon down. It had been their hope that it would fall out of the sky, landing in the palace district. There had been some concern that it would crush part of the army when it did. Instead, it had managed that last burst of flight to put it in a high, defensible position. Thus, they were climbing Fort Dricken to meet it. They knew they were near the top when Hugo started growling. By the time they reached the heavy stone door, Hugo was barking in earnest. The rest of the wardens opened the door in dead silence. The top of Fort Dricken was a desolate world all its own. A cold, bitter wind whipped up from the city below, heavy with the scent of smoke and destruction. Still, it was dark, as their only light was the dull gray sky above. The tower itself had seen better days. One quarter had been broken apart and tumbled by Khazar's blast, leaving a treacherous slope of broken stone. 4 watchtowers stood at each corner of the platform, though 2 were showing signs of the battle with crumbling facades. A lone raven perched on top of one of the nearly tumbled towers. And there, thrashing its great scaled bulk against a third tower, was the archdemon. It flapped its wings in an attempt to get airborne, but the spines were torn straight through, and it only twisted and roared in frustration. Felicity had to steady her racing heart. In theory, dragons were fascinating, but in practice, they were terrifying. There was no signal. One moment they were standing at the center of the rooftop, the next, Percival had hefted his great sword and burst into a charge, and the other 3 men followed only a couple paces behind him. The dragon sensed their presence, turning to them with a roar that shook the tower top. Felicity threw a spirit shield between it and Percy, just as the dragon released its breath attack. The burst of spirit magic split around it and the wardens rushed between the split blast, unharmed. The archdemon stood up to its full height, taking its head out of reach. Its tail thrashed, and its forearms braced against the stone. Percival lunged, bringing his sword across the creature's collarbone, and the dragon retaliated with a swipe of its front talon, sending Percy tumbling and skidding 10 feet back. Felicity immediately sent a healing spell in his direction. She had a shield ready and lyrium potions to spare. She had to keep them all alive. As the dragon bent its head forward to snap at Percival, a streak of leather and blonde hair slid underneath its torso, slashing a line across its belly with his sword. The dragon kicked at Zevran, but the elf dodged nimbly away, and Finian could be seen darting under its sweeping tail to do the same to one of its ankles. The archdemon turned on the 2 elves and released a blast of magic that sent them both flying. Felicity's heart skipped a beat as Finian rolled right to the edge of rooftop, bounced another foot, and slipped over. Finian! Multiple voices cried, possibly Felicity's own among them, and Percival lunged at the archdemon in full rage. Zevran stumbled to his feet and ran toward where the other elf had disappeared, but the archdemon lumbered after him, snapping down at the assassin, and Zev had to hit the ground to avoid its jaws. Percival dug his sword into the dragon's flank, until its tail caught him and knocked him aside. A moment later, Riordan was there, his bastard sword stabbing into the side of the archdemon's mouth. It screeched and jerked its head up, and Riordan went up with it. Riordan held tightly to his sword, lodged in the demon's jaw, as it bucked again. It likely helped that Percival was repeatedly slamming his sword into the archdemon's shoulder and Hugo had his jaws firmly around one ankle. The dragon swiped at Percival with one talon, but the warrior only turned his sword and slashed the talon open even as it knocked him down again. Felicity was fast to heal him, though she still expected he'd ache in the morning from all these blows. Provided he survived. Riordan's bucking sword finally slipped, and the older warden somehow managed to time it so he was tossed back over the dragon's head, landing on the archdemon's shoulder. He brought his sword around and dug it into the monster's back. The archdemon bucked, slamming Riordan with one of its destroyed wings. Felicity healed the damage caused by the impact. Felicity was afforded enough of a view of the battle to see Zevran pull Finian back up over the lip of the tower, and she sighed in relief. As if sensing it, the elven warden flashed a shaky smile across the battlefield at her, and the pair moved around and came in at the archdemon from opposing sides. The archdemon roared and spit spirit magic at them, knocking each of them aside after a few slices of their blades. Felicity kept a steady stream of healing, not daring to waste mana for so much as a spirit bolt. The archdemon would have reduced them all to swollen, bloody pulps without it. It was hard to say whether their steady attacks were doing much good against it. Then, Hugo leapt up and latched onto the archdemon's throat and held on with the tenacity only a Maberry could summon. The archdemon roared and surged upward, its massive wings flapping in a futile attempt to get airborne. Percival, Zevran, and Finian were all thrown clear by the force of it, and the dragon managed to rise a good 15 in the air and launch 40 feet across the tower top. Hugo's grip failed, and he plunged from the apex of the leap, landing hard on the stone with a resounding crunch. Riordan, however, was still on its back, and he lunged up and plunged his sword into the back of its neck. The dragon lurched to the side and slammed into one of the nearly tumbled towers on top of Fort Dricken. The structure groaned and collapsed under the weight, and both dragon and warden nearly went down with it as stones collapsed atop them, and the entire corner of the roof crumbled and tilted. Except that the dragon slammed itself into the side of the tower with a screech, leaving Riordan dangling over the city, the only thing preventing his fall being his one remaining hand on his sword, which was in turn lodged between two of the dragon's scales. As Felicity watched in horror, the blade of the sword slipped out of the dragon, and it seemed for a moment that Riordan was suspended in the air. Then, he fell. The wardens atop the tower all froze as the reality of that sank in, even as the archdemon clawed its way back to the tower top. They'd just lost Riordan. Percival and Finian shared a meaningful look, and Finn nodded once. Then, they charged, with Zevran sticking close to their heels. Felicity followed in their wake, stopping to kneel beside Hugo's crumpled form. The dog had landed badly, shattering his shoulder against the stone. As Felicity knelt beside him and sent a surge of healing into him, he whimpered and tried to stand. Felicity laid a hand to the back of his head. "No, Hugo. Stay." Hugo whimpered again, but laid back down and just breathed. He would probably live, but he would certainly be out for the rest of the fight. Then Felicity stood and turned her attention back to the other three, immediately casting another heal as she noticed scratch marks across Percy's face and chest. She downed a lyrium potion quickly, and even that took long enough that Zevran got bitten in the side. She was tempted to call the assassin back to her. He was not a warden, so he did not need to be near it, but she doubted he'd comply if she did. So she made do with healing fervently. Percival had mastered the art of staying in front and under it, even as it twisted around, and Finian had started climbing his way up the dragon's back, using his daggers as anchors. Zevran dodged around behind it, tearing open its flanks. Finally, it appeared that the archdemon was weakening. It roared and spit, but its movements seemed to be slowing, and its own blackened blood coated its scales. Then, Finian reached the juncture between the dragon's back and neck, and his offhand dagger suddenly emitted a pulse of light as he plunged it in. The dragon screamed, throwing its head back to shriek to the sky. Finn shimmied another foot up its neck, and Zevran and Percy both plunged their swords into its underbelly. The archdemon twisted and thrashed, its jaws closing around Zevran and throwing him across the rooftop directly at Felicity. Felicity emitted a telekinetic pulse as Zevran hit her to stop the momentum from sending them both off the tower altogether, and they both fell to the stone instead. The elf let out a groan. Felicity could catalogue a number of bruises about her own person from the impact, but they were far too minor to warrant an extension of her dwindling pool of magic. She pushed up to her knees, sending out more healing as Percival shrugged off another slash of those claws and slammed his sword into its talons. Finian crested to the dragon's head, bracing himself against its horns as the head tossed in an attempt to throw the elf off. Felicity healed his wrenched shoulder, then turned her attention to Zevran. The assassin was right beside her, trying with little success to climb to his feet. Judging by the way he clutched at his chest, he'd cracked a few ribs. She sent a pulse of healing through him and reached for her last lyrium potion. His head snapped over to her. "Do not waste your magic on me." He snapped, but successfully found his feet nonetheless. In front of them, the dragon roared in pain, and the two turned in time to see Finian, clinging to the dragon's snout, plunging a dagger deep into the archdemon's eye. The dragon arched back and, as if in slow motion, Percival raised his great sword for one final lunge, leaping and sliding under the dragon to rend its underbelly in half. The monster shrieked one last time, and Felicity was forced to look away as a light brighter than the Golden City itself erupted from the archdemon. Felicity fought to keep her feet under the concussive force of magic that tore out of the thing, whipping into them like a mighty wind for a few very long seconds. Finally, the light and the magic died down, and already Felicity could feel the difference. The ever-present singing of her tainted blood had stopped, and around and below her, she could feel the darkspawn's feral confusion, the horde cast adrift as its anchor disappeared. The light died down, revealing the dragon's collapsed form, and two equally still smaller figures, one underneath the dragon's head and one on top. "No!" Zevran choked, shoving to his feet. "No, no, 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 amor no te mueras." The elf took off running toward them, and the raw panic in Zevran's voice made Felicity realize that Zevran knew. Finian had told Zevran. A violation of protocol, perhaps, but Felicity could not say that she wouldn't have done the same thing. Zevran scrambled up the dragon's side toward Finn, so Felicity headed for the other warden. Percival had landed half under the dragon's throat, his armor partially crushed under the sheer weight. She knelt beside him, vaguely aware of the stream of panicked Antivan from above her. She took a breath and sent a tendril of healing into Percival's body. It took. Her heart stuttered. The magic took, which meant Percival was still alive. She sent in more, focused on repairing the damage done by the dragon falling atop him. Once she'd set things back in motion, and she'd confirmed that Percy was breathing, she glanced up sadly. Poor Zevran. The Antivan was shaking, balancing precariously on the dragon as he bent over Finian. With shaking hands, he smoothed the hair back from Finn's face. Then, Finian coughed. Felicity froze, trying to make sense of that, even as Zevran let out a joyous, relieved laugh and hugged Finn to him. Finian twitched and mumbled something against the assassin's chest. Felicity turned blankly to stare down at Percival, who was also stirring vaguely. But that wasn't possible. Someone had to take the archdemon's soul. There had certainly been no darkspawn closer than these two. "Oh, usted tonto, loco hermoso. I am going to kill you, for scaring me like that," Zevran mumbled, and Felicity could not understand it. Underneath her, Percival's eyes fluttered open. "Percival." She tried, because he had a glazed, dazed look in his eyes. She couldn't detect any major head wounds. "Are you all right?" Percy blinked, his eyes focusing on the distant silhouette of a black bird, flying away from the tower. "I almost didn't expect it to work." "Pardon." His eyes turned up to meet hers and, for a moment, he looked about to say something. Then, he shook his head to himself and closed his eyes. "We won. Anything else is in the Maker's hands now." Slowly, Felicity nodded, and stood up to let him have some rest. After taking down an archdemon, they certainly all deserved it. 151 Moving forward, looking back. The victory celebration was a weird combination of highbrow and low. Ferelden's best and brightest gathered in the still broken up land's mead chamber to celebrate the simple fact that they were alive. Alistair switched between following Anara around to make nice with all the nobles, and running interference when Okaren got rowdy and copped a feel. It was enough to make that first part tolerable. At some point, Alistair managed to shake off his not-so-blushing bride. He snagged a slab of cheese from a platter of refreshments and spotted Percival leaning against the wall nearby, watching the festivities with a hint of a smile and fiddling idly with a ring on his finger. For the first time that Alistair had ever seen, Percy well and truly looked like a noble. He was dressed in a dapper suit coat of red and orange, and his blonde hair was clean and brushed, swept back into a neat tail. Alistair might have doubted that he'd been crushed by a dragon 2 days ago, if not for the fading talon marks he now sported across his face. Alistair sidled up beside him with a grin. "Enjoying the show, are you?" He offered the other man a chunk of his cheese. Percy thought for a moment before taking the offering. "There is a certain theater to it, I suppose." "Glad you enjoy." Alistair took a bite of his own bit. "Because I am going to make you endure it with me a lot." Percy cast him a curious look. "Still looking to give me a holding, are you?" "Dead set on it." "You're getting some sort of title, the more grandiose the better." "I'm quite evil like that." Percival chuckled softly and popped the cheese into his mouth. "I think I have a good defense. Grey Wardens can't hold office." "Right. Well, we kind of threw that guideline out the window, didn't we?" Percy choked, and Alistair cackled. "At the very least, you're getting an award. Hero of Ferelden. Finian and Felicity were up there same as I. I don't see why I'm getting the credit. It's part of being a leader, I guess." Alistair shrugged. "I'll be ready for that to be behind me," Percy confessed, "once Weishaupt sends the replacement commander." Actually, a familiar voice broke in, and Alistair's heart constricted. They may not be sending one. Felicity slipped out of the crowd and stood in front of them. She was stunning. She wore new robes, gold and deep blue velvet, that made her skin look like smooth caramel. Her silky black hair was held back with a jeweled pin, and Alistair had to catch his breath as he realized the pin was in the shape of a rose. She smiled up at both of them, and Alistair kind of wanted to grab her and just start running. "While we were waiting in Redcliffe, Riordan and I sent a courier to Weishaupt, recommending you, Percival, as the replacement commander." Percy stared at her for a moment, but then let his head fall forward with a sigh. "You know, I'm not even particularly surprised." "You'll do a good job," Felicity said. "And now that you're something of a local hero, well, I doubt they'll deny the request." Percival cast Alistair a wry look. "It seems you'll be getting your wish after all." Alistair nodded, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. Felicity met his eyes, for the first time in forever, and it was awesome and horrible at the same time. Percy's hand fell on his shoulder. "I'll leave you to it." And then he departed, leaving them alone. Alistair swallowed. "Felicity." And her eyes dropped, and whatever they had shared just then was gone. "I'm going back to the Circle Tower. Just so you're aware." Alistair let out a breath and nodded. "When?" "Whenever the mages leave. Irving says I could take a teaching position if I wanted, though I think I might concentrate on documenting the blight first." "That's good. You'll be good at that." Alistair smiled, and she returned it shyly. "You already are." "Thank you." She paused, pressing her lips together. "For everything, I mean. What we had. I'll never forget you." She touched her pin, and Alistair's heart broke all over again. "Yeah," he managed. "Me neither." He looked down. "I'll miss you." She smiled sadly. "Oh, I'm sure you'll get over it." She bobbed a bow, and walked away, and it took him a minute to realize he was staring after her. He shook himself and headed back to the refreshments, this time grabbing up a goblet of wine. He downed it all in one drink, then grabbed up another. He was king. That meant he got to get a little tipsy if he wanted to. He nursed the second goblet as he wound through the crowd. Nobles and heroes all sent him smiles and nods, and he returned them politely. Even Vartag Gavorn seemed to be loosening up, sitting up on the balcony with a mug of something that looked quite a bit stronger than wine. He spotted Garrot near the front of the hall, showing a bunch of the elves from the alienage a trick with something long and metallic. As Alistair approached, something on the contraption exploded with a pop, and they all burst out laughing. "I would appreciate it, Garrot," Alistair said, if you did not burn down the palace 2 days after we managed to chase the darkspawn out of it." The elves immediately all ducked their heads and backed away, and Alistair frowned at their departure. Had Finn really come from that? Alistair would have to work on that, wouldn't he? Garrot just shrugged blithely, rolling up the contraption and tucking it away in his scavenger's bag. "Where's the excitement in that, eh? Well, I suppose I'll need someone here to keep me awake." "Sorry, Tin Can. Can't stay." "What?" Alistair pulled up short and stared down at the dwarf. "Why not?" Garrot shrugged apologetically. "Gotta head back to Orzammer and make sure Belen's running his little social revolution the right way." He shifted and looked down uncomfortably. "Besides, just because we killed an archdemon don't mean the darkspawn are gone, you know? I figured they could use a warden, down in the tunnels." "So you're going to keep fighting?" Alistair couldn't stay mad at Garrot about that. The rest of them were looking forward to a break, but he was going to keep fighting the good fight. Marnan would probably have had something to say about that, I bet. "Yeah," he said roughly. "Something preachy about how I'm maybe not the lazy, heartless criminal she thought I was." Garrot gave him a crooked smirk. "After everything, I'm kinda starting to believe she'd be right about that." Alistair clapped a hand on the dwarf's shoulder. "Well, good luck. You ever need anything?" "Yeah, I won't wait to work my connections, promise you that." They shared a smile, and Alistair moved on. Next, he spotted Sten, who, when questioned, announced his intention to return to Par Valen. No real surprises there, the giant had been straightforward about that from the beginning. The way he hinted that he fully expected a Qunari invasion in the near future was a little unnerving, though. Perhaps that bridge was best left crossed at a later date. Next, he encountered Leliana. The woman had just snuck in through a side entrance, and he had to do a double take just to recognize her. He was used to seeing her in leathers or chantry robes, but this? She looked like an Orlshian noblewoman, a natural beauty in bright silks and shimmering jewelry. She gave him a hurried smile and asked, "Have you seen Mila? I need to speak with her." "Not yet, though, by process of elimination, I would guess she's somewhere on this side of the room." He waved his hand in the direction he was heading, and she fell into step beside him. "Is everything all right?" No. It is complicated." Leliana's eyes scanned the crowd, and she made a soft sound and hurried forward. Alistair followed. Mila was located at the very back of the hall, near a door that led into the service hallways. 2 Templars stood at attention back against the wall, with Khazar trussed up and docile between them. Mila was arguing in vain with the Templars. She, unlike just about everyone else, was dressed up in leathers, either because she was prepared for battle or because she had nothing else to wear. The Templars didn't waver, and Khazar didn't look up. Ever since the battle, they'd kept his magic silenced and his hands tied, and it was unspoken common knowledge that, as soon as the celebrations were done, Khazar was being dragged off to Eonar. Only the fact that he'd helped save the world, and Wynn's timely intervention, had stopped the Knight Commander from cutting off the elf's head in the Palace District Square, to hear Garrot tell it. All right, Alistair said, stepping past Mila and waving his arms in a shooing motion toward Khazar's babysitters. "Take a break, both of you." The Templars looked at him dubiously, and Alistair gave them his best, "I've your maker damned king, look." Reluctantly, they handed him the lead to the mage's ropes and had the courtesy to at least go around the corner. "Delithalan, are you all right?" Mila asked as soon as they were out of earshot. "Have they hurt you?" "I'm fine," Khazar mumbled softly. "Scared out of my mind, but fine." "You're just going to stand here and let them cart you off?" Alistair asked, "Because really?" Khazar shook his head, still staring at the floor. "I can't control it. Maybe it's better for everyone this way." "I do not believe that," Leliana said. "You are a hero. You deserve to be free." Mila glanced back at Leliana. "Vihanan." The 2 women exchanged a significant glance, and Leliana bit her lip. "Mila, there is something we must discuss." The Dalish elf nodded and turned to the bard, and Alistair was left waiting awkwardly aside, holding Khazar's leash. "I care about you," Leliana said. "I really do." But there are things that are more important than just one person. Mila nodded. I agree. We both have a duty. Me to my people, and you to yours. Lelyana reached out, and the two women clasped hands. I cannot allow the sacred ashes to remain unknown and unguarded. Not now that we know where they are, and what they can do. There is so much good that can be done by working with them, nor can they be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. And I could never devote my life to that and keep my sanity, Mila agreed with a fond smile, and Lelyana giggled. It is just as well. You could not have lasted where I am headed either. I think that, the less I know the better, no. It was Mila's turn to chuckle, and that was just weird. Alistair hadn't known she could do that. You have always been wiser than you let on, Ma Vihanan. And you have always been far kinder than you let on. Lelyana squeezed Mila's hands one more time, then nodded and let go. Mila took a breath and turned back toward Khazar and, by extension, Alistair. You need not admit defeat, Dalithalan. There may be another way. Khazar had been watching the exchange just as Alistair had. He looked resigned, but hopeful too. What? The keeper of my clan, Marathari, is a wise woman who is knowledgeable about many ancient magics. She may know a way to help you fix your condition. She'd help me. If you are willing to be helped. Khazar's head rose. Yep, definitely not so resigned anymore. You couldn't keep Khazar down for long. What about the Templars? They'd hunt me as an apostate. Mila's smile was enigmatic. The Dalish protect their own, Dalithalan. You'd have nothing to fear. Khazar's eyes darted around. With a chuckle, Lelyana stepped forward to give him a hug. As she did, she deftly drew a dagger from her bodice and cut his bindings. Lelyana beamed and whispered. You'd better hurry. We'll cover for you. Khazar turned a stunned gaze to her, then switched it over to Alistair. Really? You'll let me run? Alistair couldn't help a smirk of his own, dropping the rope. If anyone asks, you used your demonic mind control powers against me. Khazar snorted, briskly unwinding the ropes from around his arms. While he did, Mila and Lelyana shared one last long, lingering kiss, so, yeah. Alistair stared at Khazar until they were well and truly done. Then, Mila took Khazar's hand, nodded a fond farewell to both of them, and pulled the smaller elf out through the side door, the pair disappearing into the darkness. Lelyana smiled and looked after them. When Alistair turned back to her, she was wiping her eyes, but she still smiled up at Alistair. I am going to go distract the Templars for a little longer. You should probably make yourself scarce, so as to draw the least attention, no. Alistair nodded numbly and headed back into the party. Someone was playing a tune with a flute, leading a lively dance near the center of the room. Finian wove through the dancers, laughing and spinning men and women around in pure joy. And wherever Finn was, there was Zevran, leaning back against the wall with a goblet in one hand. Alistair settled next the assassin, who cast him an arched brow. So, you are the worst assassin ever. Just so you know. Really now? Amused, Zevran took a sip. Do tell. You didn't even kill one of us. You had 8 of us. 8. Do you know how much that fails, for you not to manage to kill one of 8? Alas, but it is true, Zevran chuckled. But consider, my warden king, that it is actually a great deal more difficult keeping you alive, rather than killing you, and I have been most diligent in ensuring the former of late. For that reason, I will consider the fact that so many of you survived with a great deal of pride. You do have a point. Finn danced up, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. Both elves wore simple, but nice outfits, though Alistair knew them well enough to spot the daggers they had both hidden under their jackets. So, Alistair. Finian announced cheerfully, and Alistair was immediately suspicious. What did you do? So help me Finn, if you've been pickpocketing my court, we're going to have words. Zevran chuckled. No, no. Nothing like that. Finian produced a slab of cheese out of thin air. Cheese. Finn. All right, all right. Finian's face fell a bit, and he tilted his head to one side with a sigh. I just wanted to wait until after the party was done to break the news. What, are you leaving too? Finn blinked, staring at him in startlement. How do you know? Alistair threw his hands in the air. Only because everyone else is. Duncan might as well have not even gathered everyone, if you're all just going back home. Alistair paused, realizing something. Wait, how does that even work? You can't leave to go back home. You're there. I mean, there's here. We're where you're there. Do go on. Zevran said with a smirk. I want to see if it is actually possible to hurt yourself doing that. I'm not talking to you. You're mean. Alistair, Finian cut in smoothly. I'm not staying in Denerim. He shrugged with a bashful smile. Honestly, I think the alienage will be more than fine without me. Especially with you running things. Oh, don't put that sort of pressure on me, Finn. Now I have to be all progressive and stuff. I just mean you won't let jerks like Von Kendalls and Rendenhau run rampant. You've met too many jerks to tolerate it. Well, yeah. I suppose that's true. So I feel like I'm leaving Denerim in good hands. Finn stuck his hands in his pockets bashfully. But, there's something I need to fix. But what would you? And then it hit Alistair. The alienage. The slavers. Oh. Yeah. Finian exchanged a look with Zevran. It's a long journey, and I don't know how long it's going to take to track everyone down. So, bottom line. I'll be gone for quite a while. You don't have to feel guilty about that whole thing, you know. Finn looked down, his smile sad. I can't help it. If I hadn't killed Vaughn, the city would never have turned on the elves like that, and Loghain would never have gotten that far without someone noticing. Finding them and sending them back home? It's the least I can do. Do not fret, my friend, Zevran said smoothly to Alistair. I will keep him out of trouble. Alistair snorted. Get him into trouble, more like. The two elves shared a look, and Finian smirked. Well yeah. That's half the fun. Just, right, or something. All right. Finn smiled and even had the gall to bow regally. Alistair wondered how he hadn't throttled the elf by now. Someone cleared their throat nearby, and Alistair turned to see Anara waiting off to the side. Well, she said. It seems things are beginning to wind down. Shall we give our subjects one last chance to adore you, my king? There was a dry, haughty humor in her words. He wasn't sure he liked it yet, but he supposed he could get used to it. He could have been tied to worse people. All right. One moment. Alistair downed the last of his goblet, and the two elves waved him off with sniggers. Anara held out her hand pointedly, and Alistair remembered to crook his arm so that she could put a hand on his elbow and be led like a proper lady. Yeah, right. Like anyone really thought Alistair was the one leading Anara. Still, though, it wasn't so bad, he supposed. He'd hate every minute of the kingly stuff. All the expectations, and the adulation, and the bowing and scraping, and the tedious politics. Yeah, he'd detest all that, and that part would never change. But the part where he got to make a difference for the better? That part, he may be able to live with. As one, the king and queen of Ferelden stepped up onto the balcony. Epilogue, a new landscape. Mila crested the ridge and paused, taking in the view before her. The mountains sprawled in all directions, save where they met the sea behind her. She could see the lonely shapes of hamlets and ruins alike breaking into the greens and browns of a lush, craggy wilderness. Her single companion limped up behind her, breathing hard, and all but collapsed on the trail they'd been following. Are we almost there? He panted. I cannot say just yet, Delithalan. He groaned, his head drooping over his knees. Fantastic. You know, I wish I had been as smart as the wolf, and refused to get on the blasted boat. That brought a pang of regret. The white wolf had indeed been reluctant to cross the waking sea, and so they'd been forced to leave him behind, in Ferelden. Mila could not begrudge their once companion for that, she had been reluctant to go north as well. Everything she was had bade her turn west, to Haven. That was where her heart was headed, after all. However, what she had told her Vihanan was true. She would not be able to devote her life to a maker she did not follow, any more than Leliana could live among the Dalish. Asking her to would have been cruel, because Leliana thrived on excitement and her connection with other people. Among the people of the Dales, she would have gotten neither of those things, and it would have destroyed her. No, it was better this way. Mila had a duty to her kin to uphold. The security and sanity of her companion was at stake, and that let her set the pang of longing aside. She was Dalish. She had been trained to treasure the past, to dwell within it. She had always clung to tradition and history, with nary a thought of where that might lead. But now she had learned otherwise. The wardens had taught her to live in the moment, instead of clinging to a history that none of them had lived. And Leliana had taught her to hope, not just for the distant dream of Arlathan, but for the well-being and happiness of nearer, more attainable futures. Leliana had turned bitterness and blind hatred into hope. She would treasure hope forever, and never forget the amazing, strange woman who had enabled it. She turned back to her ward. "Do you need a rest? Just, give me a minute." Khazar ran his hands through his hair. His face was flushed, and his red blonde hair was darkened to copper with sweat. "Where are we?" Mila turned her gaze back over the wilderness. "A mountainous region, it seems." He cast her a flat look. "I meant, like, on a map." "Where are we on a map?" "We are not on a map at the moment, Dalithalan." He looked up at her, narrow-eyed. "Are you teasing me?" "So it would seem." She felt the tug of a smile on her face. "It's official. I'm going insane." Khazar climbed to his feet. "Let's get my inevitable descent over with, then." "Where to?" "The trail of the Aravals continues this way." Mila started down the path, and he followed at a slower pace behind. Epilogue, questions. Can't believe the sorts of things I've found in this place. Did you know that there are hidden messages about how to summon a demon etched under the third desk on the left? It doesn't use mana or anything, just a pre-drawn circle. Felicity hummed acknowledgement as Danya's words washed over her, the human scanning the spines of the books. There had to be something here on the wardens. The order was old enough for it. Not that I'd ever try it myself, of course, but it does have some interesting implications, don't you think? What if there are other summoning circles around Thedas, which can just poke a hole in the fate if someone knows the right words to speak? Felicity glanced down at the dwarf, and, being on the top rung of the ladder so as to reach the library's uppermost shelves, it was a long way down. "I suspect it is a misinterpretation, Danya. More likely, the demon was already previously summoned, and has merely been bound to a physical object on our plane. These sciences would merely release the bindings." Danya hummed thoughtfully, scouring the shelves below her with fervor equaling her own. "Well, that can't be safe. Doesn't proximity to demonic presences cause, weird stuff?" "Weird stuff?" Felicity couldn't help a small smile, despite the ache that lingered in her chest even now. "Is that the technical term for it? Better than crazy nugthuggery, right?" Danya's grin was bright and easy, as always. "I suspect unnatural manifestations would be more suited to scholarly texts on the subject." The dwarf shrugged. "You're the writer. I'm just the idea girl." Then, she resumed searching the bookshelves. That was true, in part. In the weeks since her return to Kinloch Hold, Danya had been a blessing in dwarven form. The girl's constant, curious prattling had kept Felicity sufficiently distracted while they helped the circle with repairs and cleaning after the attack. Now, most of the heavy lifting was done, but the entire structure still stank of corruption and death, and that was unlikely to ever be purged by scrubbing alone. It was an uncomfortable thought, but the presence of a bright, curious mind always willing to leech knowledge from her proved distraction from that. Danya was enough distraction for anyone. Sometimes, in her more somber moments, Felicity marveled that this must be what other people experienced around her. Now, Felicity and many of the weaker casters had been dismissed from the heavy labor, and Felicity was taking advantage of the time to delve into the circle library, as she'd done so many times before the blight had happened. Now, though, her goal was not sweeping curiosity and pursuit of general knowledge. No, she wished to answer a single question: how might a Grey Warden survive killing an archdemon? It was a tricky proposition to be certain, and one she would never think to let anyone else in on, much less someone as talkative as Danya. Even so, it was nice to have the help and the company, even if Danya couldn't be given instructions beyond, pull anything that references Grey Wardens and magic. She would be far more likely to find answers at Weishaupt. However, something in her quailed at the prospect of involving the first warden. He was notoriously caught up in politics, and she had since learned to be wary of handing politicians weapons. To what nefarious purposes might someone like Belen or Loghain have used knowledge such as this? No. She would keep it secret, and thus keep it secure. As far as anyone outside the four on top of the tower knew, Riordan had taken the final blow, as was traditional. Felicity had just laid her hand on a title regarding the second blight when a commotion coming from outside the library drew her attention away. She looked up to see a trail of grim-faced Templars coming from deeper within the tower. Between them was Cullen, the only indication of his current status in the order being the fact that his hands were tied behind his back. Felicity couldn't help but watch him as they passed, the hard, haunted look in his eyes enough to make her healing instincts fight the reins. She'd forgiven him for his harsh words during the blight. She couldn't even raise much outrage at what he'd more recently done to those two apprentices. Instead, she ached, wanting to fix him so badly, and turn him back into the sweet man who had once stuttered every time she was in the room. As if sensing her regard, his eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for a moment the air was tense and heavy. Then, at the same time, they both looked away. They said he was to be transferred north, to a circle better equipped to attend to his instabilities than the scattered, ruined remains of the Ferelden circle. Felicity made it a point not to know where. She had no right to know. Just as she had no right to worry about what Alistair was doing right now. Was he feeling any more comfortable in a position of authority? Had he made any proclamations yet? How was he adjusting to his wife? Painful questions, and none more than the last. But she had no right to be jealous. He'd given her the chance, and she'd pushed it right back at him. It had been the right thing to do, but that didn't make it hurt any less. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the bookshelf and just breathing, until well after the sound of armored footsteps passed. "Felicity? Are you all right?" She looked down. Danya was directly below her, peering up at her with wide, earnest eyes. "Why yes, Danya, I'm fine." She pushed back and took a moment to collect herself. "Now, you were saying about summoning." "Oh, right." Danya's eyes lit with excitement. "Well, my thought is this. It is possible to tear the veil, right? With lots of death at one time in one location? It wears it down, that's where we get hauntings. So what if it were possible to create a very localized rip, just a little pinprick, and somehow create a mechanical means to access it? It would require magic to create at first, of course, but once the material mechanism was set in place." Felicity listened to the dwarf talk, letting the girl's brilliant enthusiasm wash her worries away. This, here, was where she was meant to be, tossing theories back and forth with Danya and the mages, while searching for the answers to the most curious of mysteries. Once, she had demanded that Wynne take her out of the tower, where she could be useful, but she could not see anything more useful than this. Even so, she let her hand stray back to her hair, which she had pulled back with a clip made from a single, delicate, petrified rose. Epilogue, Honor. The Hurlock swung his jagged blade in a wide arc, but Garrot ducked and rolled under it, feeling it graze his boots as he tumbled somewhat awkwardly due to the unfamiliar weight strapped to his back. The Darkspawn growled and turned to meet him, only for Cardal to step in and give the Darkspawn Watfer. The Legion captain let out a triumphant roar and buried his sword into the monster's torso. Garrot hopped to his feet and left the Hurlock to the Legionnaire, slinking up to sink his dagger into the exposed back of a Genlock opponent. He dodged the charge of an ogre, then grabbed a particular vial out of his bag and chucked it at the gigantic Darkspawn. The vial broke and splattered acid across its back, and the ogre threw its head back and roared. Even as the monster turned to identify its attacker, Garrot smirked and ducked out of its sight. Finally, after a bit more ducking and stabbing, the band of Darkspawn was down. Good thing, too, the werax on his back was bogging him down something fierce. "You still in one piece, Warden?" Cardal called with a smirk. "Ain't dead yet," he responded easily, brushing himself off. Which is more than can be said for the unlucky sods with me. Cardal and the half-dozen Legion of the Dead members with him chuckled, even while they inspected themselves for contamination. Coming up clean, they all gathered behind their captain to await orders. Garrote nodded and led Cardal and his minions around the next corner. The place looked a lot different, now. The Legion of the Dead had cleared out the stragglers, gotten rid of all the tainted corpses, burned the gunk off the walls, all that stuff. Bonamar would never be fit to live in, of course, but it no longer looked like something out of a bad fever dream. Even so, Garrote recognized the room when they emerged out of the twisting tunnels. There was the place where the creature had been. There was the ledge Branka had observed them from. And there was the tunnel that Marnan had defended against an angry horde long enough for them to escape to the next room. They'd found her there, on the way back, collapsed on top of a pile of the buggers. She'd killed every last one before expiring herself, and that was just a little bit awesome. This it, Warden? Yeah. This is it. Garrote dropped his pack and unslung the were-axe from his back. They'd fed her body to the magma at the anvil, but it seemed like there should be something here. He tested the weight of the axe, unfamiliar with the bulky thing. There was a stone pillar, back behind where the brood mother had been. It, like much of the other refuse, had been cleared. Good. He unclipped a special vial from his belt, and carefully uncapped it, making sure not to let any of the caustic substance inside coat his fingers. With expert care, he splashed it on the pillar, just above his head. Then, he stepped back, hefted the axe, brought it above his head, and swung it into the rock with all his might. With the stone softened by his mixture, the blade of the axe sank into it. Garrote held it there until the rock hardened again, creating a memoriam that no one would be able to remove without destroying the stone itself. It would be stone stubborn, just like her. He reached for his belt and unclipped the chisel he'd brought along, then painstakingly tapped the words into the rock, just below the axe. Here went to the stone Marnan Ojican, Grey Warden, leader, and friend. With a sigh, Garrote stepped back. There you go, old girl. It ain't elegant, but you wouldn't have wanted that anyway. He smirked up at the axe and gave it a tap. It held, and would hold for 1,000 years, if Garrote had gotten his formula right, and Garrote always got his formula right. One day, I'll hear the calling and come back here to meet you. That sound fair, princess? Only the silence of the stone answered him, and he lowered his hand with a chuckle. Talking to a rock. What a sentimental sod. All right, Warden. Cardal asked from behind him. Garrote smirked and turned away, slowly walking back to meet the Legion of the Dead. Never better, Cardal. You ready to move on? Lots of darkspawn to kill. That there are, Warden. Lead the way. He spared one last glance back at the little memorial he'd made and, with a chuckle, went off to do his warden duty. Epilogue, the next great adventure. Minrathis was a pearl on the edge of the sea. White marble structures stretched across the harbor, shimmering in the sun. The air coming off the bay was hot and salty. Well, here we are, boys, a Riveni accent said, and the ship's captain leaned against the rail. End of the road. Zev hummed, eyeing the woman's ample bosom appreciatively. Dare we ask, dear Isabella, what you are doing docking in the capital of the Imperium? If I answer that, sweet thing, you'll have to tell me what you and your handsome friend are up to. She winked at Finn, and he repressed a smirk. We dare not, Finian said with utmost seriousness. It's top secret business for the King of Ferelden. I see, she purred. Sounds sexy. She pressed herself close to Finian and played with the ties of his armor. You know, my business isn't too pressing. Perhaps I should come with you. Keep you boys out of trouble. To his amusement, her hand wandered lower, and he fought not to burst out laughing. His cuirass was abruptly tugged backwards, out of Captain Isabella's reach. He barked a laugh, only to have his lips swallowed up by a very hot, very possessive kiss. Finn gave a token struggle, only to have a nip and a squeeze utterly melt his knees, and he was clinging within a minute. Once satisfied, Zevran pulled away, and both turned to Isabella. Finian snickered at her impressive pout, complete with a put-out hip jut. You're both so cruel not to share, but fine. I shall make do with a few very hot fantasies. She gave Finn one last slap on the hindquarters before sashaying off to start giving her boys direction on pulling into port. Zevran's arm pressed against his lower back, and Finian leaned against his side, turning to look back over the beautiful city ahead of them. Somewhere among that sunshine and marble, there was a dirty, seedy underbelly that had bought and sold his friends and elders. "So," Finn said lightly, "have you ever been to Tevinter, Zev?" "I cannot say I have, Amor. The two of us will have to explore together. Freeing slaves. Assassinating blood mages. It should prove to be quite an adventure, no?" Finn gave his cohort a grin. "Put that way, it does sound pretty fun." Zevran winked. "We will be the absolute terror of slavers and the dream of every maiden looking for a dashing hero. But alas, we will be too rugged and independent to fall for their ample charms." Finn turned back toward the approaching port, his stomach twisting nervously. "Yeah." Zevran's arm tightened briefly, and, more softly, he said, "We will find them, Amor." "Yeah," Finn breathed. "We will." Epilogue, Awakening. Percy had never thought he'd be following this road again. After everything that had happened, there was a pall over the very idea of it in his mind. These lands were corrupted by the name of the one who had owned it, and he had never wanted anything to do with it. The road was empty and war-torn, yet the fields and copses of trees showed growth. Renewal. Also, rain. It seemed that Alistair had finally found that fitting punishment he'd threatened, when they'd thrust the crown at him all those months ago. Percy sighed and reached a hand up to the amulet at his chest. There lay his Warden's Oath amulet, filled with the blood of the joining, reminding him of his duty and his life. And there, tied into it now, was the ring. She'd left it by the bed. There was no note, no explanation at all, simply the ring. Sometimes, though, when he held it, he felt a pang of sorrow or regret that wasn't his own. It was as tied to him as the tainted blood in his veins. The entire blight seemed like a long dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The deaths of his family, Ostagar, the other wardens, Morrigan, the land's meat, the Battle of Denerim, sometimes he felt that he was trapped in the Fade, in a reality not his making, and he might release himself had he only the willpower. He set his hand to the ring, and knew that, wherever she was, Morrigan was feeling the same. Hugo made a sound, and Percival glanced down at his only traveling companion. The Maberry had shattered his shoulder during the battle with the archdemon, and even now walked with a slight limp. He would likely carry that to the end of his days, just as Percival's once maker-blessed face now had a set of craggy claw scars across it. The scars still twinged, sometimes, when Darkspawn were near. Now, Hugo's attention was turned forward, to the road ahead, and Percival followed the hound's gaze. Sure enough, a lone figure was running toward him. Beyond it, he could make out the silhouette of a fort in the distance. His destination, if memory served. The figure resolved itself into an armored knight sporting the local colors. She stopped in front of Percival, and he regarded her curiously. "Is everything all right, miss?" "Yes, fine." She panted. "Are you, the Warden Commander?" Percy fought not to flinch. Well, it wasn't like the appointment had surprised him. It was just official now, stamped and sealed straight from Weishaupt. "I am. Percival Cousland, at your service. We were told you'd be coming." She straightened and saluted. "I'll be your escort to the keep." He allowed a small smile. "I wasn't aware that I needed one, but thank you. It wasn't my idea. I certainly wouldn't accuse the hero of Ferelden of needing to be walked across the Arling. But the Senes Chal sent me, so here I am." "Ah, yes. Bureaucrats do tend to be overly sensitive to such things." He started down the road again, the knight falling in step by his side opposite his Maberry. "I suppose I'll have to get used to it, if I'm to be the Arl as well as the commander." She bobbed a nod and sent him a hesitant smile. "That you will. Still, it will be a relief to have some order here again." "I'll do my best. What may I call you?" "Oh, right. I'm Sarum Harry, sir. And if I may say so, welcome to Amaranthin. Check the description for the links to the author."